everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual tour of our inaugural exhibit here in the Elizabeth Dole Gallery and Reading Room, dedicated to the life and career public service of Senator Elizabeth Dole. I'm Audrey Coleman. I'm Associate Director here at the Institute and Director of Museum and Archives. So our inaugural exhibit in this space is called What Would a Woman Offer Her Country? Elizabeth Dole's groundbreaking, trailblazing life of public service. We were really inspired by a speech that she gave in 1999 as she was exploring the possibility of being the Republican nominee for president in 2000. She asked the audience, what would I, as a woman, offer my country? And we really stuck in on that quote because it could be read two different ways. One is emphasizing the kind of contributions that women could make to public life and leadership that we know are diminished in some way at this point, that we're still growing for equality in that area. And the other way you can read the question is that she might be asked to defend her qualifications as a woman in leadership, and unfortunately, after many decades of service, be asked to reiterate her qualifications in that area. Well, we wanted to answer that question with this exhibit and showcase all of her contributions from the mid-60s up until today. And these are all materials from her archives that she donated to the Institute in 2017. Elizabeth Dole herself did many firsts. She accomplished many firsts. She was the first woman Department of Transportation Secretary. She was the first woman to serve two American presidents in two different cabinets, the Department of Transportation and the Department of Labor. She was the first woman head of the American Red Cross in the 1990s, after its founder, Clara Barton, started the organization in the 20th century. She was the first woman senator from North Carolina to be elected to the U.S. Congress, to the Senate. And these are all very remarkable. But we also wanted to, while we're celebrating breaking the glass ceiling in that area, we also wanted to highlight what the work that she did really contributed and what the work of leadership really looks like on the national level. So as we walk through the exhibit, I think you'll discover that there are many wonderful stories to be told about her, women in leadership, and what government service at the top levels of our country look like. And I think you'll enjoy it. So come with me for a few minutes and I'll take you around the exhibit. Probably the best way to think about the beginning of Elizabeth Dole's career in Washington is to think about outreach. In the late 60s, she was an intern for the newly developed Department of Health, Environment, and Welfare under President Johnson. She was an intern and worked for a year on special education and education opportunities for the deaf community. That was really her first taste of experience in the White House working for the presidential administration. Following that, she worked for the White House Office of Consumer Affairs, starting in the late 60s under President Richard Nixon. You can see in this album page, she's one woman of 5 different federal trade commissioners. And this is a theme that you see throughout her papers and throughout the exhibit, is that she's a single woman or few women among groups and groups of men. So it's interesting to think about how starting out in the 1960s with the expectations that were in place for women, which was not career-oriented in general. We were just starting to experience the women's liberation movement and the understanding that women should be out with equality of opportunity in the workforce. It's interesting to put yourself in that mindset when she's doing all of this work. But she started out in the Office of Consumer Affairs under President Nixon and then moved to the Federal Trade Commission in the early 70s. These positions allowed her to do lots and lots of outreach, again, with people, with the American people, with trying to develop policies, consumer protection policies and consumer awareness policies. During the 1960s, there was a major boom in commerce and consumer rights. Some of you might remember Ralph Nader, who's still around, was really a proponent of consumer rights and advocacy. Elizabeth Dole fit right into that mold, making sure that people, particularly women, as the chief managers generally of the household, had the resources and the knowledge to deal with a really booming economy in the 1960s, the post-war economy that was just starting to get very mature at that time. So in consumer affairs, she's traveling around the country a lot, working face-to-face with groups of people to make sure they know their rights as consumers and connect them with resources to protect them. When she goes to the Federal Trade Commission, she's actually working more with businesses, with the legal community, kind of from the top down on consumer protections. And she works in this area for about 10 years. And so in this case, we are talking about her early career, again, with the FTC. While she was at the FTC, she received some really wonderful mentorship by a woman named Virginia Nauer. She credits Virginia Nauer with really helping her grow as a professional in the administration, in the Nixon administration, and really understanding and recognizing the power that women have to help one another when they decide to mentor other women and really create a difference for women in the workplace. So extremely influential. At the beginning of the 80s, she joined the staff of President Ronald Reagan in the White House Office of Public Liaison. She actually was in charge of doing outreach on behalf of the Reagan administration that took her all over the country. There's a wonderful article that talks about how many meetings she had between January and June. She had something like 300 meetings, and she was in charge of going out and explaining the policies of the Reagan administration all across the country to different kinds of groups, as well as promoting the involvement and the recruitment of women, minorities, and all different kinds of diverse groups to try to recruit them to the Republican Party and expand the Republican Party as a big tent. Following her service in the Office of Public Liaison, Elizabeth Dole was appointed to be the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, the first woman Secretary of Transportation, in beginning her service in 1983 under President Reagan. And this is where she really gets into the meat of policy development. The Department of Transportation deals with the transportation infrastructure of our country, and she really excelled at planning and assessing resources and systems and try to find ways to improve those, particularly with health and safety of U.S. citizens in mind, of constituents in mind. She's really well known in that area for the trifecta of policies that she implemented during this time in the department. One was the requirement that all passengers in a vehicle wear safety belts. Another one of those policies was raising the driving age to 21. And then also mandating the implementation of airbags in vehicles, in the front of vehicles. And so these are all things that we take for granted today as just things that we do and things that the auto industry produces, but these were very specific initiatives that she was involved in developing over many years to make sure that in our everyday lives that our infrastructure and as consumers are protected on the roads in the United States. During the 1980s, when Bob Dole was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, the department, the transportation secretary at times would have to report to the Finance Committee and try to obtain funding and justify policies and spending in front of the Senate Finance Committee. So there are a few pieces here in the exhibit kind of lampooning their relationship in that way, and also we have a speech featured in which she was actually, defending and proposing policies in front of Bob Dole, her husband. In the 80s, the media really has a heyday with the two of them and their power couple status and how they're both movers and shakers in Washington, but also that they're not afraid to butt heads, and sometimes those interests come into conflict, and there's a great press release about that in this case here that I think you'll enjoy seeing when you come in. Probably one of the most striking features of the gallery at this point are the portraits of Elizabeth Dole. These are reproductions of portraits, official portraits that were done of her in honor of her service as Transportation Secretary and also of Labor Secretary. These were done by celebrated portraitist Everett Raymond Kinsler. He's done hundreds of portraits for celebrities, politicians, something like 5 other presidents, and so very prolific artist. But we wanted to be sure and showcase these fine pieces. And if you look really closely in both of them, there's kind of a background picture that is really fun to spot. Following the change of presidential administrations in 1989, Elizabeth Dole was appointed to be Secretary of Labor under President George H.W. Bush. We've got a wonderful photo of her being sworn in by Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman Supreme Court Justice. And during her time as Secretary of Labor, Elizabeth Dole was really focused on developing resources and finding out how to build a workforce for the future. What kind of necessary skills did people need to develop in order to stay viable for the future? Another policy that she was interested in pursuing was the idea of supporting mothers, parents on the job with experimenting with on-site daycares and things that let families be accessible to one another while they were working and being productive members of the economy and the consumer world. So lots of connections between her previous positions, as well as really focusing on promoting the well-being of people and long-term employment viability for them. At the end of her service as Secretary of Labor, Elizabeth Dole looked for a next opportunity and was named the President of the American Red Cross through almost the whole decade of the 1990s. As I mentioned before, she was the first woman president of the ARC, of the American ARC, after Clara Barton in the 19th century. She faced a significant challenge as president because we were faced with the AIDS crisis in the 90s, and the Red Cross administers much of the nation's blood supply. So in that role, she was credited with completely revamping the collection of blood donation that we do, and really in the face of a very dangerous and unknown AIDS epidemic. Stabilizing the nation's blood supply was a huge project of hers. In addition to responding to national disasters like Hurricane Andrew and other national disasters both here and political disaster abroad. Some of you might remember the genocide in Rwanda in the mid-1990s, so she was working internationally as well. After her career at the American Red Cross, she pondered a political career and ran for Senate to represent North Carolina. She was a senator from North Carolina in the early 2000s, serving one term. And so her service, as I mentioned before, she was the first woman senator from North Carolina in the U.S. Congress. So we have a small case dedicated to her leadership in that area. She sat at the same desk that Senator Bob Dole sat at when he was a senator. So there's some nice continuity with their careers as well. We mentioned the role of mentorship in Elizabeth Dole's life and career, and Virginia Nauer as she got her start at the Federal Trade Commission. Well, Elizabeth Dole, as she worked through all her positions in the Department of Transportation, in the Department of Labor, always was paying attention to cultivating leadership and professional opportunities for women and recruiting women to the staffs of those units. So she developed a formal mentoring program in the Department of Transportation and also conducted a glass ceiling study as Secretary of Labor. This case really talks about her evolution, not only as a leader in policy, but as a leader of empowerment for women in the Republican Party and beyond. And as you can see, this is some publications showcasing her as a trailblazer, as somebody who was really making a difference and setting an example for a whole new generation of women. So all the while, over the decades, while Elizabeth Dole is acting in leadership as a public servant, of course she's active in politics as well. And these cases really tell that story. Really beginning in the 1960s, when she was a young person, she volunteered for the LBJ vice presidential campaign. So very early on, had a very clear taste for politics. By 1976, she was married to Senator Bob Dole. Bob Dole had been picked for the vice presidential nominee to run with Gerald Ford in 1976. And here, Elizabeth Dole really broke, again, some new ground. She convinced the leaders of the Republican Party, or the Ford-Dole campaign, really, that she could really make some contributions on the campaign trail on behalf of the ticket. they kind of poo-pooed that idea and were like, well, this has never really been done before. Nobody really cares what you have to say in our experience. She went out and she proved them wrong. She had her own itinerary, her own slate of visits. She made front page news wherever she went and showed them that people were ready to hear from women in the political sphere, and she made really big contributions to that ticket. So she was able to apply those skills that she learned in 1980 when Bob Dole again sought the Republican nomination in the primary season. Ronald Reagan became the nominee, the Republican nominee in the general election, but Bob Dole was exploring the presidency at that time. And Elizabeth Dole is really credited for, again, staying on the campaign trail, selling the message of Bob Dole, and then later coming on board and spreading the message for Ronald Reagan as well. It was then in the early 80s that people started making noises about that she was really vice presidential nominee material. And so by the end of the 1980s, when she was helping support Bob Dole again on the campaign trail in '88, you'll see different buttons out there promoting a dual Dole and Dole ticket. So Bob Dole for president, Elizabeth Dole for vice president. By 1996, Bob Dole is running as the Republican nominee for president, and in 1996 in San Diego, Elizabeth Dole, as his spouse, makes a wonderful, heartfelt speech. She does something that really had never been done before, which is to get down from the dais and talk among the people, very much in the style of Oprah Winfrey or an early kind of style TED Talk. So a very personal appeal and something really emotional and really getting in touch with the people at the convention, and adding again, it makes us think, what kinds of improvements can women make on the way it's always been done. Well, she did that here and countless other ways across her career. In 2000, she explored her own opportunity and is considered to be the first viable woman candidate for a major from a major political party when she was exploring the Republican nomination and running in those primaries. So in 2000, she makes a run for president, applying all of the skills that she's learned. And then 2 years later, she makes a run for the U.S. Senate and is successful and elected to the Senate. As we've said before, Elizabeth Dole is still active even after her term in the Senate ended in 2009. A couple of years later, she founded the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, and it's just really fun to watch her continue to work. And I think if you go to her website and then learn more about her foundation and then come here and see the exhibit, you'll really understand the talent, the dedication over many decades, and the difference that she's been able to make in the lives of so many Americans. So I look forward to seeing you again soon here at the Dole Institute and learning more about Elizabeth Dole. If we don't get together soon in the next few weeks, it'll be until next time, but we'll look forward to telling you the story and seeing you soon. Thanks for joining me today.